today we'll be talking about development of the next EPA strategic plan and also the impact that strategic foresight activities can have in determining the issues that EPA will focus on in its next 5-year plan. Just a couple of housekeeping items, the usual things. To please make sure you mute your phone if you called in or your computer if you're not speaking. Also, please use the chat box to ask questions or make any comments. But we will leave some time at the end to be able to ask questions over the phone or computer. And I think that's it. With that, I will pass it on to Holly to kick things off.
All right. Thank you. Welcome, everyone, to our training focused on developing the next strategic plan. I'm going to my video on. Hi. So I'm Holly Green. I'm the director of the planning division in OPAA, in OCFO, and I manage the strategic plan process at EPA. I'm also going to introduce my colleague, Joe Greenblatt. He's the associate director of the analysis division in OPAA, and he leads the implementation of the Evidence Act and strategic foresight, which we'll also be talking about today. And of course, Beth, Beth Burchard, who already introduced herself, and she will be helping to monitor the session, and she's also on the strategic foresight team. So with that, let's go to the agenda. So as Beth mentioned, the objective of today's training presentation is to understand how EPA's strategic plan communicates and drives the agency's mission, the key components of a federal strategic plan, and the process and timeline for developing our next plan. So we will discuss today how the strategic plan fits into the context of overall agency performance, the authorities that drive federal strategic plan development, what's new for the upcoming strategic plan for 22-26, including the Evidence Act components, and an overview of strategic foresight and how future-oriented thinking can help inform the plan. So we'll walk through the key components of a plan using the current fiscal year 2018-2022 plan as an example, and finally the timeline for developing the next plan and those key points of internal engagement. And we'll have time for questions at the end, as Beth mentioned, and she'll be monitoring the chat. Okay. Just one more reminder to mute your lines. There's a lot of people on the call today. We're so excited you are all able to join us from all over OCFO and the regions as well. Just make sure everyone's muted so that we can, so that everyone can hear. Okay, so let's see, next. All right, so for context, this is a graphic showing EPA's performance management framework. We're not going to go into detail into all these pieces. Let's see, this has a little bit of a thing here. Okay. Into all the pieces today, but just to show you where strategic planning and the plan itself falls in this framework. The strategic plan being the foundation for the framework. Somebody asking a question? Okay.
The leader has muted your line. To unmute your line, press #6.
Uh-oh. Can you still hear me? I just got a note that said the leader muted my line. Okay, thank you. Sorry. Okay. The plan's goals, objectives, and strategies, along with the metrics, are planned for in our budget requests. They are monitored and advanced or adjusted and approved upon as they're implemented. So, for example, through the bowling charts and our APG action plan updates, and they're reported on various intervals throughout the year. So in the monthly business reviews, the quarterly performance reviews, and the annual performance report. So in this graphic in red, you can see how the new Evidence Act and the EPA Lean Management System and the visual management components fit within the performance framework. So for the Evidence Act, we'll be developing a learning agenda and capacity assessment new this round, and Joe will talk about that a little bit later. I just lost what's going on? Somebody, thank you. Okay. And I just lost my presentation. Okay, sorry. All right, let's move on to the next slide. You got the picture here. All right. So what is a strategic plan, and from where do federal agencies get their authority to do it, and how? So the Government Performance and Results Modernization Act of 2010, it was modernized in 2010, tells us that a strategic plan describes the general and long-term goals that an agency wants to achieve, how, the actions that we will take to realize those results, how we will address challenges and risks that will hinder those results. And there's, of course, also an evaluation component that we'll talk about a little bit more as well. It essentially covers the major functions and operations of an agency's mission. And even though it does not cover every activity that the agency carries out, everything that goes on at EPA is linked somehow to its strategic plan, even down to, for example, our performance evaluations, our staff performance evaluations that we do mid-year, end of year. Even there's a little piece where all of that is connected to the strategic plan. Everything we do at EPA is connected to this plan. So the Government Performance and Results Act also tells us the timing of the plans, and this was new in 2010, this timing and this cycle, and that they must align now with the beginning of each new term of an administration, and federal agencies must produce a new plan by the first Monday in February following the year in which the term of the president begins. So if the president is inaugurated in January of 2021, the final plan must be issued in February of 2022. So this does not give us a lot of time between when a new leadership or change in leadership arrives, and we have to communicate the agency's priorities in this process, but we make it happen. Okay, so the Evidence Act further amended the Government Performance and Results Act in 2018, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but it now requires agencies to develop a systematic approach to identify and address the most pressing policy, programmatic, and regulatory questions related to the agency's long-term goals and objectives as part of agency strategic planning. And that's really the key piece right there, is that it's an integral part of the plan now. It's not kind of a side thing, it's not optional, and it's not an appendix. It's integrated into the plan. So another authority that we work with is the Omb Circular A11, and this is the sort of the policy, regulatory, implementing guidance, and it specifies the content, the process, and the timelines for all federal strategic plans. And so we follow this guidance. For example, so in terms of the timelines, OMB aligns many of the strategic plan deliverables with the budget submission deliverable cycle. OMB A11 also encourages the use of strategic foresight to consider longer-term horizons and a broader scope of issues as part of the strategic planning, and we'll talk about that a little bit more detail as well. All right, so I will now turn it over to Joe to talk a little bit in more detail about the Evidence Act components of the strategic plan.
Can anyone not hear me? I know I had a little problems with my mic earlier.
So Joe, I think you should get get close to your mic and speak maybe a little bit louder than is natural.
Okay. So there's a session immediately following this on the Evidence Act, and we'll get into a lot more detail on the Evidence Act in that session. Here I'm just going to kind of touch the top of the waves to give you a flavor of what's in it. And the first part is that the Evidence Act is really new. It was only signed while we were furloughed in last winter. And the agency right now is just beginning to implement it. The whole idea behind the act is that we will really have an opportunity to make strategic investments in data, in analyses, and program evaluations that will help us, the agency, meet its mission in a much more effective and efficient way. And that we should be looking at more strategic investments, not just short-term investments to help us move forward. Currently, we are working on a schedule that would produce some interim products for the Act. The OMB is required that would go out with the agency's budget submission to OMB in September of this year. And those include three major things: an interim learning agenda. I'll explain a little bit about what a learning agenda is in a bit. An interim capacity assessment and an FY22 evaluation plan. So the Evidence Act, it's actually of 2018, although it was signed in 2019. No, I'm wrong. It was signed in 2020. The Evidence Act consists of three titles. The first title is Federal Evidence Building Activities. There's three major documents that are required. One is a learning agenda or evidence building agenda. The second is a capacity assessment. And the third is an evaluation plan. The Act also required the designation of three new officials within the agency. These are all supposed to be senior career officials. The first is an evaluation officer. We currently are recruiting for a permanent evaluation officer, which we hope to hire shortly. Until then, David Bloom, the Deputy Chief Financial Officer, is acting in that position. There's also a statistical official that's required, and the administrator has designated Alex Martin in the Office of Policy as the statistical official. And the third, and this is under Title II, is a Chief Data Officer, and that responsibility has fallen on Richard Allen in OMS. There's also two other titles. The second one deals with the governance of data, open data, strategically planning for the acquisition and management of data, for the transmittal of data. And the third title deals with inadvertent disclosure of confidential information and making sure that the agency has the ability to protect information that shouldn't be disseminated, but with the assumption that almost all federal information should be publicly available. So it's really an interesting part of the Act. And on Title II and Title III, these are really codifications of activities that the agencies, the federal government has already been engaged with through OMB efforts. So let me just talk a little bit about a learning agenda, because that's really kind of the core to the whole thing. A learning agenda is built around questions that the agency needs to address in order to advance its mission, to improve the effectiveness or efficiency of a program. And right now we're kind of going through that process with this interim assessment. The administrator and Chief of Operations, Henry Darwin, identified three learning priority areas. They are grant commitments met, workforce, and drinking water system compliance. We've identified leads for each of those. David Hinden is from OECA is the lead for drinking water compliance. Lynn Hitchens is the lead for workforce, and Robin Richardson is the lead for grant commitments left. And right now they're working on developing the priority questions, which involve stakeholder outreach, both internal and internal stakeholders. We've also developed an Evidence Act work group. This is a standing work group that is co-chaired by the 3 designated officials I just mentioned, and that includes representatives from EPA's programs and some lead regions. So again, more about the Evidence Act in the next session if you choose to participate in that. Let me just pause and ask if there's any questions at this point before I go on to strategic foresight. Seeing none. So strategic foresight is something that the agency has been involved in since the late 80s, actually, and we've had many activities and projects on strategic foresight. The idea of strategic foresight, as Holly mentioned, is to improve strategic planning by considering a longer time frame, broader issues than we might normally consider and just kind of straight lining our programs out. And the idea of strategic foresight is to take advantage of emerging opportunities, be prepared to address emerging risks, and encourage creative and critical thinking in the strategic planning process. There's a number of advantages in doing this. For one, it allows us to challenge our assumptions, and it allows us to get ahead of the curve in many cases by taking immediate actions to prepare for things that may be coming down the road, instead of waiting for them to become crises and big issues that are very expensive to address. So that's kind of the overall purpose of strategic foresight. As I said, we've been doing strategic foresight for quite some time, and they've actually had an impact on many of the issues that are discussed in the strategic plan. And I've listed several of these here. Now, one of the important things to understand is strategic foresight is a series of methodologies and approaches that I'll get to in a minute that are part of the mosaic of the information that the agency is dealing with at any time. It's not a crystal ball. It doesn't usually come up with anything new, but it often helps take things that are kind of on the margins of thinking and focus attention on those because they may be important to the agency. And usually it gives us a little head start on being able to address those issues, as I said, before they become major problems. So we've had, like I said, a number of these issues that have been identified through foresight activities over the years and have made their way into one form or another being addressed in the strategic plans. And strategic foresight, kind of the underlying concept rests in the principle that the future is really, by and large, unpredictable. The farther out into the future we get, the more unpredictable it becomes. So when we're looking at the future from the present, from our current perspective, we need to look at the possibility that there may be a range of possible futures out there that the agency may have to deal with, and that there's many disruptive events and factors that can change the way trends go. So generally in foresight, we like to look at plausible alternatives, which we often call scenarios, and immerse different parts of the agency in those scenarios to see what types of things the agency could start to do now that would help prepare for alternative scenarios. And here's some of the different types of activities that we often use in futures. First is scanning, which basically is reviewing literature and talking to influential people, people who've been thinking about the future, thought leaders, both inside and outside of the agency, to try to identify what the major drivers of change may be, what some of the innovations are that are coming down the road in terms of technology and other types of innovations, policy, programmatic, And then from that basis, we often do things like forecasting, where we try to look at what some of the key variables may be and how they might change over time. We look at scenarios. As I said, these are stories of what might happen in the future. And then normative forecasting and backcasting, where we actually try to pick what we feel is a desirable outcome, desirable future, and back our way into what types of activities might we start undertaking now to be able to address those and prepare for those. So that's kind of Foresight in a nutshell. And let me just stop there again, see if there's any questions, and if not, I'll turn it back over to Holly.
So I think the default was to have the participants muted, but you can type your question in the chat if you're not able to unmute yourself. I see one person said hi, Joe, but I'm not sure if it's a question.
Christine, do you have a question? Oh, here it is. So Christine asks, has the agency started running the scenario planning yet?
No, actually we haven't yet. We are still in the midst of figuring out what types of foresight activities we may be doing. Right now we are initiating some horizon scanning that should take us through the end of the fiscal year. And when we see the results of the horizon scanning, maybe before that, we'll start engaging our leadership with trying to figure out what types of activities might be feasible moving into the strategic planning cycle. One thing we are doing, and what we're very conscious of, is trying to build off of and support the efforts that we're doing for the Evidence Act. The first full Evidence Act submission, not this interim stuff that I talked about before, full interim act submissions are due with the next strategic plan. So we're looking at doing Foresight now to support that submission as well. And hopefully we'll be able to identify some areas that we can really dive into and make some inroads on.
Christine asks also, is there anything that we did since the discussion with Robin Champ from the Defense Threat Reduction Agency? And I think the answer is no. Did you want to respond to that?
We published a paper that benchmarked federal foresight activities across the government, and that was really the last major foresight activity that we did. Be happy to share the reference information for that paper. But other than that, I think there's been some scattering of foresight activities that have been going around across the agency. We took a slight pause in our EPA Strategic Foresight Community of Practice. We will be holding a webinar at the end of this month on food waste, and hopefully
The leader has unmuted your line.
Oh, and that's something I should have mentioned. We do have a strategic foresight community of practice in the agency. If anyone is not on that list to receive our invitations and to participate in those webinars, please send an email to Beth Burchard, and we will add you to the list.
I unmuted folks on the phone, so if you have a question on the phone, you should be able to ask that now.
We have another
Allison
question.
asked, do you ever look back to see if past forecasting was accurate?
Actually, I have.
You look back to see if...
Yeah. So it depends on the forecast, but most forecasts break down after 3 to 5 years. They tend to be, and of course, it depends what you mean by accurate. There's usually, in any forecast, a disruptive event that occurs that's not envisioned in just doing a trend in a straight lining or a trend out into the future years. And also because most of the things we deal with are in a very complex environment, that it's really very difficult to predict what those disruptive events may be and how other factors may influence the forecast. So going back to this cone of uncertainty, that's kind of the principle behind it. Is it's really difficult after you get out past a few years to really forecast what events are. I did do an analysis, a very detailed one that I'd be happy to share with anyone on the supersonic transport and how some of the forecasts for that evolved, and some of them were very good, especially on technology, but then on kind of the future of the supersonic transport, they fell apart because of some disruptive and unforeseen events. So it really depends, but the general concept is that the farther you get out into the future, the less reliable forecasts are.
Christine also asked if senior leadership has been open to long-term planning, for instance, 20 years out.
It depends on the senior leadership. We haven't really made a strong effort under the current administration. I am cautiously optimistic that they will embrace this approach. But until we have something more concrete that we can move forward on, I just don't know. Under previous administrations, it also was varied, the extent to which they were enthusiastic about doing this type of long-term planning. And part of the issue, and it's not any political party, is that this type of work usually involves testing of assumptions, and if you already have a very good idea of what you want to do and where you want to go, then testing of assumptions is not necessarily something that's always warm and welcome. And in our paper that Beth and I co-authored with Tom O'Farrell and others, and Bob Olson, we actually have a pretty lengthy discussion about some of the obstacles to doing strategic foresight in the federal government. So again, if anybody's interested, send me or Beth or Tom O'Farrell an email. I'd be happy to share with you the references to that paper and a link to the open source version of it.
Michael Wolf asked, does learning agenda change on an annual basis?
The learning agenda is essentially a long-term plan. However, it's kind of an evergreen document. The agency is not required to submit revisions every year, but we are encouraged by OMB to update it regularly. We don't know exactly what that means yet. And we don't really have a plan in place yet for updating it. But I suspect it would be, as with the strategic plan, we would do that through the annual planning process. Now, with the Evidence Act, we are literally building the plane as we are flying it. So things evolve on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis.
I think that's the end of the question for now.
Holly, I believe you're up.
Okay. All right, I'm next. Thank you. Let me turn my video back on. Okay. Hello again. All right. So I thank you, Joe, for that overview and the outline of the Evidence Act and strategic foresight. Now we'll kind of transition into more of the details of the strategic plan and the process. So I'm going to walk through now the key components of a strategic plan using the current plan as an example. For those of you who have been in the agency longer than a few years, you probably know that the structure of the plan, the length, and of course the priorities vary by administration. But we'll use this as an example. Every plan must have some key pieces, regardless of administration and regardless of agency. Every plan must have strategic goals, strategic objectives, long-term performance goals, and agency priority goals. Of course, as Joe mentioned, new in the plan this coming cycle is the learning agenda and the capacity assessment. And again, the overall plan represents and communicates the long-term goals and objectives that the agency aims to achieve, what actions that will take to realize those goals, and of course, all the challenges and the risks. They also want us to describe what might hinder us from achieving those goals. It's really supposed to drive the mission towards results and to achieve the overall objectives. Okay, so I'll go through each of those pieces in turn. So for the strategic goals and objectives, so that you can see here, this is the example from this current plan. The strategic goals are typically set at the political or very senior leadership level. A strategic goal is a statement of aim or purpose, and it's supposed to articulate clear statements of what the agency wants to achieve to advance its mission. And they should be outcome oriented. So as you can see, the EPA currently, we have 3 goals. They encompass the media work of the agency, as well as mission support and operations and kind of our partnerships and how we work outside the agency. In previous strategic plans, the goals consisted primarily of that media work, and the mission support and human capital and partnerships. All of that work was contained in another part of the plan called cross-agency strategies. And if you plans need to have those strategies if they're not also in the goals. But as long as your plan covers all of what your agency does, then you've met the spirit of the act. So you can see here, goal 1, cleaner, healthier environments, more effective partnerships, goal 2, and goal 3, greater certainty, compliance, and effectiveness. And then all of our objectives are contained within one of those 3 goals. And so our strategic objectives then follow from the goals, and they should reflect the outcome and the management impact the agency is trying to achieve. The EPA currently has 11 strategic objectives, and here you can see under goal 1, for example, the cleaner, healthier environment, and that's where all of our media-related objectives are. So you have improve air quality, provide for clean and safe water, revitalize land and prevent contamination, and ensure the safety of chemicals in the marketplace. And those constitute the activities of those 4 offices that cover land, air, water, and chemicals. And then you have the other the partnerships. You have compliance and the mission support in the subsequent, as well as the science minority in the subsequent objectives and those goals. And again, as I mentioned earlier, the set of agency strategic objectives together should be comprehensive of the agency's activity, but it does not have to spell out every activity the agency is involved in. But everything that we do ties back to one of those objectives and goals. Okay. So the next set of required elements are called performance goals as opposed to strategic goals. And these link to the strategic objectives, and they tend to be more quantitative. So for EPA, we have two types of performance goals. We have our long-term performance goals and our agency performance goals, our agency priority goals. So the long-term performance goals are 5-year goals. They're our highest priorities. They focus on mission results, and they are a statement of the level of performance to be accomplished within a time frame. So it includes, so this is what's spelled out in the guidance that we received, which is it includes a performance indicator, a target, and a time period. So these are a little bit shorthanded here, but the full language of a long-term performance goal, for example, you can see there is 1.1.1, which is by September 30th, 2022, which is our current plan, reduce the number of non-attainment areas to 101. So it has the what you're looking at, the time period, and the number. So likewise, an agency priority goal is similar to the long-term, but it's a 2-year goal. It represents a near-term result or achievement that the agency leadership wants to improve on or accomplish within 2 years. And it tends to rely predominantly on agency implementation as opposed to some outside force like a budget or legislative initiative. And the APGs reflect the near-term top priorities of the leadership, not necessarily the full scope of the agency mission. Agencies are supposed to include a limited number of goals, somewhere between 2 and 8. And for EPA, in 2018 and 2019 cycle, we had 6 agency priority goals. And then those are included in the plan itself. And then after those 2 years, we have the opportunity to continue or develop new agency priority goals. And so for the next cycle, which are not, we don't update the plan with those, but we do continue to report out on another set of agency priority goals. We also have 6, 4 that we continued and 2 that were added for lead and PFAS, being 2 of our highest priorities in the agency right now. So, let's see. Okay, and so what we did with this strategic plan for, I don't know if you can see this little graphic here, but so we have a long-term performance goal, for example, for reducing non-attainment areas. And in this plan, what leadership decided to do was to create an agency priority goal as a 2-year mark within those long-term performance goals. So one of our agency priority goals is, by, instead of September 22, it's by September 2019, improve air quality, by reducing the number of non-attainment areas to 138. So kind of that's your halfway mark. We did not always do that. In past years, sometimes the agency priority goals were separate from the long-term performance goals. This round, they integrated them as 2-year marks within the 4 or 5-year target. So let's see. Okay, and then so lastly here, these are longer-term goals, but they are the framework for the budget structure and the foundation for EPA planning, budgeting, and accountability. And they set the framework for advancing annual progress on the priorities through our budget measures, which are now called annual priority goals. An unfortunate acronym now because it's duplicated, but these are 1-year targets that are communicated in the annual planning and budgeting process. And the end-of-year results for those annual metrics or goals are reported on in our annual performance report each year. Next one. Okay, a little bit more on budget, because I know we have a lot of budget people in our audience. So how does the strategic plan connect to the budget? So as we've learned, hopefully today, the plan outlines the strategic goals and objectives and our performance goals, or the measures for our objectives, so that we know if we've achieved them. The EPA budget proposal, of course, provides the direction and the resources to support the mission and address the priorities through agency programs. So the budget request will include the proposed funds and FTE for the EPA programs under each goal and objective in order to carry out those strategies. And the budget also describes agency performance towards the goals and objectives to help justify the funding request. So for each annual budget request, each program and EPA must be linked to a strategic plan, goal, and objective in order to justify those resources. So at the outset of a new strategic plan, EPA, like for example here in 1822 plan, we had to map each of our programs to the new goal and objectives. So here's an example of the document where we mapped out Objective 3.4, streamline and modernize, and Objective 3.5, improve efficiency and effectiveness. And we list each of the EPA programs that are connected to those objectives, and that advance those priorities.
The leader has muted your line. To unmute your line, press #6.
All right, so now I'll talk a little bit about the development plan for the new strategic plan. So this, as you recall from the beginning of the presentation, our target deadline for the final plan on the street is February of 2022. But of course, it takes a while to get there. So we are, we start early, which means this summer which we're almost there. It's June. And we begin, as Joe mentioned, starting with conducting strategic foresight and other analytical exercises to inform the plan. So that can include horizon scanning, scenario planning, and other analysis of our performance data. So that's where we start. Then in the spring of 2021, so now this could be either just before the one administration to the next, or as the new administration is coming on, we have a small team of political and career leaders that propose, and the administrator approves basically the structure and the framework for the plan, including the strategic goals and objectives, as well as the long-term performance goals and the agency priority goals. We also, during this time period, will be developing our annotated outline of the learning agenda and an initial capacity assessment. And at this time, we will then communicate the framework to the agency and begin to engage the other programs in drafting the plan details. So at this point, we would issue guidance to the agency's senior leadership to identify the goal leads, who will then work with any contributing programs to those goals, as well as the lead region coordinator, to start to draft the details of the plan, including, how do we communicate the mission and the importance of our activities in this plan, both internally and externally. And so then in the summer, somebody's playing with the screen. I can't see it. Oh, Joe, bigger. So in the summer of 2021, then we begin to develop the full text of a draft strategic plan. And that's when, in addition to those narratives to kind of describe the importance of each of the goals and objectives, we now start to put pen to paper on the strategies for implementing those objectives. And in doing that, we, of course, consider the results of all of the analysis work that preceded this, including strategic foresight, the learning agenda, capacity assessment. All of this is part of the strategic plan. And we do that piece that I talked about in the budget section to ensure that all of the agency's programs and projects are assigned to the most appropriate objectives for budget formulation, so that we know we can implement the plan. So that's next summer. starts to get real. And then, okay. Then in the fall of 2021, September specifically, is when some of the budget deliverables are due to OMB. We submit the full text draft of the strategic plan, the draft, that first set of draft agency priority goal statements, the draft learning agenda, and the capacity assessment. And we submit that to OMB concurrent with the September budget submission. Then OMB will provide feedback. We incorporate that feedback before we can put out the plan for public comment. There is a public comment period. We assess those comments, we revise the plan, and we issue another draft to OMB. This is a close to final draft. They do have the opportunity, another round of feedback and comments that we resolve with them. And then early February 22nd, February of 2022, we issue the final plan. That includes the
leader has unmuted your line.
The learning agenda, the capacity assessment, and the 2024 annual evaluation plan. All of that goes along with the FY 2023 President's budget. And so then once we issue that plan and we celebrate, then that plan becomes part of the framework that we talked about at the beginning of the session, and we report out on progress towards achieving those goals and objectives through the long-term performance goals and the other metrics throughout the year. So now I will stop there and see if there are questions. So I see.
Holly, Tamika had her hand raised.
Okay. Hand raised. Let's see, what do I do with that? You have to unmute her to talk. Is that what you're trying to do, or?
It should be unmuted.
Okay, go ahead if you have a question. Okay, I'm not hearing it. Maybe just we'll just stick to the chat. I'm happy to repeat the question for people, and it might be the easiest way. I'm not sure. I see some questions in there, Beth. Let's see.
Yeah, Howard asked if you'll be sending out a copy of the PowerPoint presentation to the participants.
Yes, I believe that all the presentations will be available for everyone. But yes, we'll make sure everyone gets a copy of the presentation, but I feel like they will do that globally. But if not, I will certainly make sure you get one. Okay, so the next question. Do we ever consider, good question, do we ever consider the realisticness of receiving resources necessary to carry out a goal when setting the goal, or do we just shoot for the stars, ask for what we think we need, keeping in mind the fact that there's, let's see now, what happened? Okay, I think I know the gist of the question. Okay, so the planning, there's the planning and then there's the budgeting. And so at the outset, when we create the plan, I think it's with the goal in mind of, what is the agency's mission? What do we want to, what do we, sort of the political leadership, want to accomplish, and how are we going to get there? The budget is, of course, a very close component, and we request the resources that that we believe will be able to achieve those objectives. It doesn't always seem that way, but that is the intent. The budgeting process is a whole nother set of trainings that I will not step into. I'm not the expert in budgeting, but it is complicated in terms of what we request and then what we actually get and all of that. But It does align in that submission, that final submission.
It looks like Kathy has a question. Kathy O'Brien.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you.
So it's just that.
Wait a minute.
No, we can't hear you, Kathy.
I can't hear you now.
Okay.
Not really.
You can't hear me.
Oh, yes, I can now. Mm-hmm.
I feel like there's an echo, so I apologize. Do you hear me?
Kathy, you might want to turn your microphone up.
What do I need to do?
Talk louder.
Okay. Let me take that another break, since I obviously have technical issues. When we develop a strategic plan, we do this under existing resources.
Well, how about while we wait for Kathy to find her voice, I can address Howard's question. The learning agenda, for Howard asked, can I briefly describe what the learning agenda is? It's a document that describes what the major, most important priority questions are for the agency, what evidence building activity the agency plans to collect and undertake to address those questions. And that's pretty much it. It's really a strategy document for how the agency is going to develop most important evidence to advance the agency's mission. As I said, Aaron will be talking about that in much more detail in a couple minutes on the next session on the Evidence Act. And please feel free to follow up with Aaron Kosian, myself, or anybody else on our team for more information on that.
Hey, Joe, can you hear me now?
Just barely, Kathy.
Okay, I will type my response.
So I'm going to log off of this session now to join the other session and prepare for that with Aaron Kosian. Again, I encourage y'all to join that session. We'll hold off a couple minutes, I think, to start that. If you have any questions about strategic foresight, Beth is on the phone on this call. She can continue to talk about that. And on Evidence Act, be happy to address any questions or issues that you may have offline or in the next session. Thank you all for participating, and I will see you then. Bye.
Okay. Thank you all so much for joining. We will let you go so you can have 5 minutes to go on to the next session. Thank you all again, and of course, shoot me a note if you have any other questions. Take care. Bye.
The leader has disconnected. The conference will be terminated in 5 minutes.
Hey Beth, can you just remember to download the recording? Hello? Hey, sorry.